There's also a crash of a flying saucer in Roswell during the peak of that solar cycle. The CIA was created out of the OSS, and we saw the launch of the Korean War. And we see other events following that. The late 60s took place during solar maximum, solar cycle 20, 1967 to 1969. And by the way, these years that I'm reading, that's the years that we have the peak. It usually goes from 3 to 5 years. Each solar cycle, it varies. Sometimes it's short, sometimes it's a little bit longer. Height of the Vietnam War, peace demonstrations, worldwide student uprising, Czechoslovakian uprising, USSR invasions, in U.S. inner-city riots, Israeli-Arab war, Woodstock and height of hippie movement, uprising in France, Prague Spring moon landing, MLK and Bobby Kennedy assassinated. And there's a lot more things that take place in the next cycle. For example, when Afghanistan was invaded by Russia, it took place during solar cycle 21. The Iraq-Iran war began during that solar cycle. The Shah of Iran was overthrown. In the 1988 to 1992 period, we see a number of other events that are extremely historic. For example, the USSR begins to pull out from Afghanistan, and we see the staged collapse of the Soviet Union. We also saw the Tiananmen Square incident in China, and the Berlin Wall fell, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Iraqi troops invade Kuwait. Bush Sr. gives New World Order speech. The Gulf War begins. We also saw the LA riots, all during solar cycle 22. In the next solar cycle 23, and there's a lot of things that started to kick off as we approach the millennium point in time. For example, the WTO protests in 1999, and other protests that were starting to increase at that point in time, and yet 9/11 hadn't even happened yet. But already the masses were reacting to these changes that they were feeling in their bodies. We saw the worldwide Y2K scare. Heroin overdoses skyrocket in Portland. Bush is given the election by the Supreme Court. And the 2001 to 2003 period. September 11th, 2001. You know, if you use that typo there. So-called war on terrorism begins. Invasion of Afghanistan. Patriot Act signed into law. The invasion of Iraq. Because, again, these aren't wars. These are invasions. And, of course, mass protests against the war. Before they invaded Iraq, as we all remember, record numbers of protests, as well as afterwards. As we started going into the minimum, alternative media continued to expand, but protest numbers got smaller and smaller and smaller, obviously, especially after the so-called election of the last so-called president. So SolarFlex, 2001 to 2002. We can see from this chart that solar activity starts to ramp up right before 9/11 and continues to maintain its strength throughout the period of time where they invaded Afghanistan. And it starts to decline slightly in activity in 2002, but this is still the center of the maximum portion. We started going in the minimum phase around 2003, 2004. This is what we have seen in the last couple of years in this cycle, number 24. Descent in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. Obama overthrows Libya. By the way, 8 years to the day that Bush attacked Iraq. Bush attacked Iraq March 19th, 2003. Libya was struck March 19th, 2011. And of course, we started to see media coverage of protests all over the world, not only in the Middle East, but Europe, China, and many other countries. And the United States, not limited to Occupy Wall Street. Also during this period, we saw Fukushima. In March of 2011, President Barack Obama signed the NDAA, Syrian Civil War. North Korea, the controlled wild card, points missiles at South Korea and threatens Hawaii and Japan. And of course, after the biggest solar flare this year, that took place on April 11th, 2013, we saw the Boston staged false flag bombing. Engineered at a specific point in the timeline, where people are most likely to react emotionally with fear to such an event. So there are also trends with economic cycles and the sun. And this chart was put together by Michael Manderville. And the arrows that I put here indicate the recession periods. So here we see on the left side of the screen, we see the Great Depression, which began during a solar peak. And we see other events, other recessions. This chart is 1986 to 2003. And we see the Bush Senior recession right here, and the dot-com bubble bursting right here. And when I looked at this chart, a couple things came to mind. Because during solar minimums, there's less human activity, or as Stravinsky calls it, human excitability. So when I saw that in 1913, there was a record low numbers of sunspots that occurred in that year. That was the year the Federal Reserve was created. If we look at 2008, that's when the banker bailout was initiated. Also a record low sunspot count year. Less activity, less expected response from human beings, less expected protests, more times to launch things when you don't want people to react to things that you launch. So they use the maximum cycle, and they also use the minimum. And notice how Occupy Wall Street took a couple of years to get moving after this 2008 launched the banker bailout scheme. In late 2011, sunspots increased, and that was around the same time period we saw an increase in protests and other things. So this has also been discussed by Forbes magazine, who published this headline in 2011. Riots, wild markets. Do space storms drive us mad? And believe it or not, we were just talking about the Federal Reserve. They quote a study that the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta conducted in 2003, where they found that such storms could affect the stock market, as traders were more likely to make pessimistic choices. Their report states that unusually high levels of geomagnetic activity have a negative and statistically and economically significant effect on the following week's stock returns for all U.S. stock market indexes. In addition to changes in the economy, cycles of war, there are changes that we see within the climate, even though this is not being admitted by the UN's IPCC, because it violates their official view of what's causing global warming. But here's an equation provided by Mitch Batros as to how sunspots affect the climate. Sunspots affect the solar flares, which affects the magnetic field, which affects shifting ocean and jet stream currents, which causes extreme weather and human disruption. This is a chart showing 400 years of sunspot observations. And during this period, we see what's called the, quote, Little Ice Age, where there was very little sunspot activity. And so these are some of the charts that people refer to show that our climate has been changing for a very long time. There's documented pieces of evidence that show when there's less solar activity, temperatures on the planet are lower. NASA has confirmed the solar influence over the weather. This is from 2001, the sun's chilling impact on Earth. So even though they deny that the sun has an impact on temperatures and climate and other things, that's not stopping some scientists from saying that we can halt global warming or somehow be able to stop it if we start spraying particles into the air. Even though they've been doing this for years, chemtrailing, they're now bringing it out in the open, saying we could use geoengineering, reflect solar particles back to the sun, away from the earth, and somehow that's going to make a difference. Yet they keep saying also that the sun has no impact on climate. So this isn't making very much sense. Chemtrails, as you all know, block our natural human connection with the sun, decreasing vitamin D in the body. And when that happens, you have more sickness. You have more illness. You have a decrease in the immune system. So there's been a number of earthquakes that we can also see during times where there's been an increase in solar activity, like Mount St. Helens, when it erupted in 1980. It was during a solar peak. The San Francisco earthquake, 1989, also during a solar peak. Hurricane Katrina, We saw a solar flare take place right before that occurrence. The Christchurch, New Zealand earthquake in 2011. Of course, Fukushima, Haiti, and many, many others. Of course, the earthquake in Chile is believed to have altered time and knocked the earth slightly off of its axis. Now, back in 1996, there was a solar flare that ironically created a magnitude 11.3 earthquake on the surface of the sun. Now, we just had a major solar flare. It was only an M6 solar flare, but it was the largest of the year. And these are some of the things that took place in the last several weeks following that flare. A 7.2 earthquake in Japan, a 7.8 earthquake in Iran, a 6.6 earthquake in China, flooding in the Midwest and Chicago, and there's been also a few volcanic eruptions. And the biggest concern scientists have is the next big one. In my hometown of Portland, Oregon, even though I now live off the grid in Colorado, they're saying the next big one, which is long overdue, will be well above a 9.0 magnitude. When that happens, bridges are going down in Portland. It's not going to be the most sustainable place to be because there's massive reliance still on food coming from the outside to feed the city's population. So I'm very concerned about how the people of the Pacific Northwest that get stuck in the city are going to make it. If this, of course, takes place. But here's a quote from Jay Patton from OSU. If we don't see this event by 2060, we will have exceeded 85% of all the known intervals of earthquake recurrence in 10,000 years. Now, this is how Mitch Batros, and by the way, he's the author of a book called Solar Rain. He's done a lot of research into how these solar flares affect the Earth and create Earth-changing events. This is his equation. This is what his science has led to as to how this takes place. There are layers of the Earth. There's the crust, the mantle, and there's the outer core, inner core, and then you have the core. An escalation of these charged particles, a deflation of magnetic fields, has a strong impact on the Earth's core. So the Earth's core is heating up. We talked about how the Earth's core is connected with the strength of the magnetic field. When that changes, the strength of the magnetic field changes. To compensate for the heat, the core releases liquid which filters through the inner and outer core as it penetrates into the mantle and forms large bubbles called mantle plumes. This is the process of convection, which is the transfer of heat either by circulation or movement. And it creates the bumping up of the tectonic plates, which can cause volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and other earth-changing events. This is an illustration where he's also including cosmic rays as well as solar flares, and down the process, how all these things are connected, as above, so below. So there's a popular belief also that HAARP is the sole contributor, the sole reason why we see major earthquakes in different places in the planet. And I believe that there's evidence that suggests that in reality, HAARP is not the sole cause of all the earthquakes that we've been seeing, but HAARP in fact is using the magnetic field for not only mind control purposes, but attempts to control the weather and attempts to engineer earthquakes. And this is the prime example that I'm going to present. You can find many more on the internet. Was HAARP used after a solar flare to manufacture Fukushima? There are these HAARP floodgate magnetometers that you can find online. I'm sure you've all heard of them, where people say, oh my God, HAARP was used. I've got the evidence. And people are looking at these websites online